Well, thank you for pressing the play button. Very exciting. My name's James Cridland, and coming up next here on YouTube is what Google means for podcasters. This was a presentation that I did at Podcast Movement 2019 in Orlando in Florida. And as people were streaming in through the door, and it was standing room only, they saw this on the screen, which is a little advert, which I'm hoping that you'll read too. So just to give you a few seconds just to, read it. Right, well, there we are. So what does Google mean for podcasters? I hope you're wondering that, because otherwise, why are you playing this YouTube video? I'm James Cridland. I'm editor of podnews.net. And what we're going to learn in the next 20 minutes or so is what is Google Podcasts, why you should care about Google Podcasts, how you should get listed, how to make the most of it. And it says here Q&A with a special guest. That's because I'm very lazy and I haven't actually edited that bit out. But clearly you're not going to get a Q&A because this is a YouTube video. What more do you want? Anyway, I should point out probably that Google asked me to do this because I wrote something about Google Podcasts on podnews.net. But I'm not from Google, and Google hasn't seen or approved these slides, so heaven knows what they think of them. So what is Google Podcasts? I'm going to start answering this by explaining what is not Google Podcasts, because this is actually more important. And this is not Google Podcasts. This is something called Google Play Music, or Google Play Music Podcasts. Now, Google Play Music Podcasts only works in the US and Canada. So if you ever see a link to Google Play Music Podcasts, it doesn't work in 178 countries. So it's already a bit of a silly thing. Secondly, Google Play Music Podcasts caches your audio. So your podcast host doesn't get stats. You can see the stats. You have to log into the Google Play Music Podcasts portal somehow. Thirdly, everybody tells me that Google Play Music Podcasts and indeed Google Play Music is going away soon. It's certainly taking its time, but apparently it'll be replaced by YouTube Music, which is apparently the future in terms of music within Google. So I'm told Google Play Music is just on bug fix mode anyway, but still, and number 4, and this is probably the most important thing, it is too orange. Now, I know that there are people out there who really like orange things, and there are people out there who really hate orange things. But in terms of orange things, this is Google Play Music. It's too orange. My advice on it is to be on it if you really want to, because you'll reach the 5 people who are still using it, but please don't tell anybody that you're there, because it's a mistake and it's really confusing. This is Google Podcasts. That's what it looks like, and this is what it is. Firstly, it's a service. It's not an app, it's a service. And it gets podcasts on a variety of things. And firstly, it gets podcasts onto smart speakers and things like that. So let me demonstrate with a quick demo, which will probably go wrong because all demos normally do. Hey Google, play the latest episode of Pod News Podcasting News.
All right, playing the latest episode of Pod News Podcasting News. Conan signs a 7-figure deal, apparently driving the podcast revolution.
The latest from podnews.net. Conan O'Brien's Team Coco has...
Well, he sounds like a nice man, but you can see how that worked. Here's another example. Hey Google, resume my podcast.
Sure, resuming Pod News Podcasting News. Conan signs a 7-figure deal, apparently driving the podcast revolution.
Signed a 7-figure deal with Midroll for
Hey
more
Google,
seasons of
stop. And here's a third one. Hey Google, recommend me a podcast.
All right, I have 10 podcast episodes that are ready to go. Let's start with All Songs Considered, New Mix, Brittany Howard, Big Thief, The Mesthetics, more.
Support for this podcast and the following message
Hey Google,
from Tito's.
Stop. So you can see basically how that bit works. It works all quite well, doesn't it? Coming soon, you'll be able to ask to play me a podcast about cheese, which is all pretty good. Hey Google, how am I doing? Hey Google, how am I doing?
You are doing okay, in spite of your silly British accent.
Now, you might be wondering to yourself, yes, that's all very well, James, but, it's all Amazon in this world, isn't it? It's not Google Smart Speakers. Nobody uses those. Well, I've got news for you. Because here is the smart speaker market share for Australia. 68% of us use Google devices, and 32% of us use others like Amazon or Apple's rubbish one. And in fact, these figures are much the same in places like Canada, in much of Europe as well. And the only two places that Amazon is in the lead is in the US and the UK. So think again on that one. Secondly, Google Podcasts is in Google Search. Now, Google Search, you may have heard of Google Search. It's a thing, apparently. It reaches, yes, thank you very much, Google. It is used 63,000 times a second. That's how big Google is. I should point out that the official Google statement is trillions of searches per year, maybe considerably more than that. If you could get podcasts appearing in some of those 63,000 searches per second, that would be a good thing, right? Good, because they are. Here's a search for the Joe Rogan Experience, and you can see there 3 big boxes for the 3 latest episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience, including a little play button. You press that play button, it starts playing straight in the browser. It's very cool. And you might look at that and you might go, oh, brilliant. Well, I'll subscribe to the Joe Rogan Experience in Apple Podcasts on my iPhone, and the job is done. So that's good. Here's another Google search. Podcasts about elephants. There are 3 podcasts about elephants, and you can see that they're not called Stuff You Should Know About Elephants. They're called Stuff You Should Know, and Brain Stuff, and Stuff to Blow Your Mind, but they're all episodes about elephants. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? Here's another one. Podcast with James Cridland. 3 podcasts with this ridiculous British accent. And here's a final one. Podcast from Belgium, which obviously nobody will ever search for, but still, there we go. So this is a big deal, and it may lead to people subscribing to podcasts that they have never discovered before in their favorite podcast app, and that's absolutely fine. Google Podcasts also has a web player. So if you follow links to Google Podcasts on the web or on a Mac or on an iPhone, then you get this sort of thing. It's a fully featured player. It works really well. This is a podcast you might have heard of, and all of that is good, as you can see. And it works on everything. It works on, as you can see, a laptop. It works on an iPhone. There's an iPod Touch there, where it will work fine. And then on the Android phone over there, there is the Android app. So let's talk about the Android app. The Android app, there you go. Firstly, we should just mention about Android. Android has a 78% global share of mobile phones. So only 22% of phones that are sold in the world are Apple iPhones. Now in the US it's about equal, but in many other places it's not. And as you can see, figures from Libsyn on the right-hand side, 84% of podcast downloads right now are downloaded on an Apple device and only 16% on an Android device. So this is a big game changer if we can fix this and we can actually increase the amount of Android podcast downloads to be their rightful place. So let me show you how the Apple Podcast app works. It works a little bit like this. There is the Google Podcasts button right up at the top there, which I'm going to uninstall first, because what would a demo be of Google Podcasts if I wasn't actually uninstalling it first? So here's This American Life. I've uninstalled Google Podcasts. I don't have that on the system, but nevertheless, I'm going to press the Google Podcasts button just in case, and we'll see what happens. Oh, it's opened the Google Podcasts player, which is pre-installed on every Android phone.
Support for This American Life comes from Indeed. If you're hiring with Indeed,
and that plays absolutely fine. Let's stop it because I've got no idea how loud that is. And you can see that there's a little link at the top saying, hey, you can get the app. So let's get the app. Let's install it. It's 800K, 300K. It's tiny. And what that basically gives you is it gives you a logo on your home screen, and you can get into podcasts straight from there. So the Google Podcasts player is pre-installed on every single Android phone. That is really important. And yes, there's also an app which you can download as well. So, did I mention the Google Podcasts player is installed in every Android phone, and the app, the link is from the home screen, the link from the home screen is in the Google Play Store. So it's as simple and as straightforward as that. So this button will always work on any device. If you see it, you can click it, and it will always play your podcast. It might play it on the web. It might play it in the Google Podcasts player. You may have the app installed, but it will always work. And that's a really important thing to bear in mind. So things to know about Google Podcasts are, firstly, it doesn't cache your audio. So Spotify does, Deezer does, and that's fine for some people, but not fine for other people. Google Podcasts doesn't do any of that. Google Podcasts also has proper full show notes with links. Hello, Spotify. Hello, Apple Podcasts on the web. Hello, all of these podcast players that don't even include the links. Well, Google Podcasts does on every surface that Google Podcasts exists on. It also works everywhere in the world, unlike iHeartRadio and unlike Pandora, which only works in the US, and unlike Google Play Music podcasts. It does some clever things like linking to topics mentioned in the podcast automatically if you want to find out more information about them. And search also uses speech to text, which means that it will search not just through the episode's show notes, but also through the episode's audio, which is a cool thing. In the works are things like closed captioning. That's a picture of it working. And you can see that that may well be very useful for you if you're listening to a podcast on a bus or on an aeroplane or on another loud place where it's difficult to hear. So, how to get listed in Google Podcasts. Here's how to get listed in Google Podcasts. You probably already are. It really is as simple as that, actually. So the most important way to get listed in Google Podcasts is to do nothing. Just relax with a cup of tea and Google will find you, because that's what Google's good at, and that's, let's face it, how Google works in terms of the web. Second thing to do is to ask a geek, because there are things you can do to speed that up. And you can ask your favorite geek and tell them to go to g.co/podcasts/dev, and then they can find out a ton more information about how to make sure that Google actually sees your podcast feed, g.co/podcasts/dev. Or if you really like, then a geek will tell you now. That's me. So it's a two-step process. The first thing is to link from your podcast RSS feed to your podcast's homepage. So if you're on Libsyn, you press the Edit Show Settings button, followed by you change the website address at the bottom there. So link from your podcast RSS feed to your podcast's homepage. It's a nice, simple, and straightforward thing to do there. The second thing you should do is link from your podcast's homepage to your RSS feed. Now, the way that Google recommends you do this is a bit techie. It's a link in your HTML, and it's the colored bit here. Link, type equals application RSS XML, rel equals alternate, and then you link, as you can see, to your podcast's RSS URL. And that's a jolly good thing, and that's quite techie and difficult to do on some platforms, but really easy to do on other platforms as well. So if you can, then you should do that. And if you run your own website, by the way, then you are already, as you can see, at an advantage than if you're just using a random podcast host page somewhere. Now, you do not have to do this, but it speeds up Google's discovery if you do that. So do it if you can. That would be a good plan. Something to watch out for. If you have two addresses like that, they are not the same. HTTP and HTTPS, they are definitely not the same. So make sure you always use the HTTPS version. That way Google won't get confused. And use the same website link and the same RSS feed as you give iTunes as well. Otherwise Google gets confused as well, because it has a look on there and various other places too. And here's another watch out. If you use WordPress, well, WordPress adds all kinds of complication and adds lots of other link rel alternate links. If you're not careful, you need to work out what to do with that. There are various plugins that you can use to fix all of that. So here's a tip or two. One tip is to use normal SEO rules. So make sure you give Google enough time to discover your podcast before launch, just as you would your website. So upload a trailer to Apple Podcasts, do your website, wait for approval from Apple for your podcast, and then wait for Google to find you, which it will. Then you can launch. So you're probably looking at about a month in total for that sort of thing. Here's another tip. Tip number 2, search for your podcast at podnews.net. I'm not just saying that because it's my own website. If you've messed up your link rel alternates, then Podnews will actually tell you and will help you in every step of the way. So after you've done all of that, how do you know that you're listed? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is how you know you're listed. There are 2 ways. There's a way that Google says, which is visit g.co/podcasts/links. Armed with your RSS feed. You know your RSS feed off by heart, right? So just go to g.co/podcasts/links, paste it into a page, and Google will tell you where you are on Google Podcasts. The way that I'd recommend, which is a bit easier, is to go to podnews.net, search for your podcast, find your link. It's as simple as that, and it will actually then show you where you are on Google Podcasts. Press the button and see if you're there. And use Podnews' tools to download official buttons for Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, because you want to link to it as well, because that's kind of important too. So here are the 2 buttons that you should be using. My recommendation is always to add these 2 big buttons and an embedded player to your website. So listen on Google Podcasts and listen on Apple Podcasts. I put them in that order because theoretically there are more people that could listen on Google Podcasts. That would be a good thing. These 2 buttons are not in competition because Google Podcasts, well, as you can see, mainly it's there for Android phones. Apple Podcasts is mainly for iPhones, and the 2 apps aren't on the other phones, if you see what I mean. So they're not in competition. And secondly, whenever you push people away to places like Spotify and Deezer and everything else, then you're actually making sure that you appear lower in the Apple Podcasts chart or the Google Podcasts charts and recommendations, and that might be important to you. If you search Podnews for your website, then you can choose the link to your podcast tool, and you'll grab those official links and buttons as well. For social media, I would recommend services like podfollow.com or plinkhq.com or Chartable's Smart Links. That will help you make a magic link that works on any device. Podnews.net/listen is one of those. If you try going there on your mobile phone or any device that you have, then it will automatically open the correct player. Just search for your podcast on Podnews for tools to add a link like that on your own website, or just link to your website. If you've got a website, just link to that. Never link directly to Apple Podcasts because that's silly. A few other things. Normal SEO rules apply. So if you've got a good website for your podcast with plenty of content and links, you will do better than a hosted page on a podcast host that you cannot control. So make sure that you focus on your own good website for your podcast. Your episode notes get indexed as well. They are really important for great SEO, so make sure that you focus on great episode notes because they will get you found by Google Podcasts. Google typically learns from things that lots of people do. So a little tip, if you add time codes in your show notes, and at some point, Google will probably start understanding time codes in show notes, which would be quite nice. And finally, good content that's widely linked is always better than crappy SEO keyword stuffing in all of this. So make good content and make sure that people link to it, and that's a good thing. How many plays do you know? How do you know? It would help if I could read, wouldn't it? How do you know how many plays you're getting from Google Podcasts? Well, let me tell you, your podcast host should know. But it's a bit more difficult than that, because there's more than one user agent for Google Podcasts for a start, and much of Google Podcast playback is in a browser rather than in an app, which means that your podcast host needs to be cleverer than it normally is, because it needs to check the referrers as well as the user agents. So my guess is, I think it's rather bigger than what your podcast host is currently reporting, is the actual figure. But secondly, I don't think it matters. Because Google Podcasts, by and large, is a discovery tool for podcasts, and it's not everybody's favorite app. And if your overall plays go up because more people are finding you on whatever app or player, then that's the most important thing. The most important thing isn't how many plays you get on Google Podcasts. The most important thing is how many plays you get overall. That's the most important thing. So remember, it's not an app. It's not just an app. It's a service that gets your podcasts on all kinds of devices. One final thing is a thing about WebSub. This is very techy and very dull, but I'm going to tell you it anyway because I think it's important. The way that podcasting works is you have an RSS feed, and every so often a podcast app will come to your website to have a look at your RSS feed and find out if you've published a new episode. That's basically how RSS works. But what WebSub does is it changes that from pull, where somebody pulls your feed every so often to see if you've got a new episode, to push, where somebody can actually say, hey, I really want to know when you publish a new episode, please can you tell me? And something called a hub actually tells that podcast app that you have published a brand new episode, go and get it. And so it makes your new episodes get listed instantly. So when I publish to Google Podcasts, the new episode appears within 60 seconds. It's a very instant thing. Now, WebSub is supported by Google Podcasts, it's supported by Swoot, it's supported by other WebSub compliant podcast apps, and there should be more of those. It's also supported, if you are a podcaster, by hosts like PowerPress, Omni Studio, Megafono if you're in Brazil, and other WebSub compliant podcast hosts as well. It's a really good thing, and it makes all of podcasting better. Just so happens that Google Podcasts use it, and it uses it really well. And that is Google Podcasts. Now, I would normally hand over to somebody else for a Q&A, but I'm not going to, because this is a YouTube video. But if you do have any questions and answers, then you're more than welcome to get in touch. I'm editor@podnews.net. That's editor@podnews.net. And just to confuse you, here's a different email address. Brilliant. Which you'll also find me at the other end of. And I can certainly help with any queries that you have there. And just a reminder, you should get the free daily email from podnews.net. Here's how to subscribe. Go to podnews.net. It's kind of as simple as that. Thank you for watching. I hope that was useful, and keep listening.